Hello, this is Chris Ferrara for Fatima Perspectives, the Fatima Network's commentary on current affairs in the Church. In the previous segment, we discussed the resurgence of Islam as a force to be reckoned with in a once Christian Europe, and how this was predicted by the great Catholic writer Hilaire Belloc back in 1936. We discussed also how Catholic churchmen are cooperating in the return of Islam to Europe by continuing to insist, in spite of all the evidence, that Islam is a religion of peace and has no designs of conquest, nor any teaching that would countenance violence. And in this regard, I mentioned the opinion expressed by Pope Francis in Evangelii Gaudium, an apostolic exhortation that runs about 235 pages, in which Cardinal Burke has rightly observed doesn't seem to fit the definition of a magisterial document, but rather appears to be a collection of personal observations, reflections, hopes, and aspirations by Pope Francis. In that document, Pope Francis declared that, and I quote, "Faced with disconcerting episodes of violent fundamentalism, our respect for true followers of Islam should lead us to avoid hateful generalizations, for authentic Islam and the proper reading of the Quran are opposed to every form of violence." With all due respect to Pope Francis, that is simply his opinion. As Pope, he is not an imam, he is not an exegete of the Quran, and is not in any position to tell us what authentic Islam is, or to declare that there is nothing about the Quran that in any way countenances violence. Now, when Pius XI was Pope, back in the 1920s, he commanded the entire church to pray this prayer on the feast of Christ the King. And I quote, "Be thou king of all those who even now sit in the shadow of idolatry or Islam, and refuse not to bring them into the light of thy kingdom." That's how the church viewed Islam in all of the centuries, from the time of its first emergence until the Second Vatican Council. That's why the church opposed Islam by force of arms where necessary in such key historical turning points as the Battle of Lepanto in 1571 and the Battle of Vienna in 1683. Today, of course, we see the church morally disarming herself before the resurgent threat of Islam. But let me pose this respectful question to Pope Francis. Has he not considered that the regime of Islam, wherever it is established, imposes unspeakable forms of persecution, even when it does so according to standard juridical procedures? We're not talking about a few fanatics here running amok in the streets of Paris or killing Christians in Iraq. We're talking about established juridical frameworks in Islamic nations. So, for example, it was not a few fanatics who were not true followers of Islam, but rather followers of Islam in the government of Pakistan, who sentenced Asia Bibi, a Christian convert, to death for insulting the Prophet, a sentence that was upheld by Pakistan's highest court. Francis hasn't done anything publicly that we know of to call for her release, even though the Russian Orthodox Patriarch has called for her pardon, as did Pope Benedict when he was Pope, publicly calling for Pakistan's president to pardon her from her death sentence. It wasn't a few fanatics, but the established government of Sudan that sentenced Maryam Ibrahim to death while pregnant. She was to be hanged after the delivery of her child for converting to Christianity. And they put her in jail to await childbirth, and then she would be hanged. She was freed after a storm of international protest, to which, I have to say, Pope Francis, so far as I know, contributed not one word of public support for Maryam Ibrahim, sentenced to death, not by a few fanatics, but by the government of Sudan, according to its established legal procedures. Nor was it just a few fundamentalist fanatics who sentenced the poor man Raif Badawi to 1,000 lashes to be administered in installments of 50 over 20 consecutive weeks, plus 10 years in prison. And what was his offense? He operated a blog site that was critical of Islam. Now, reports in the press indicate that the second installment of 50 lashes was postponed because his lacerated back had not healed sufficiently to receive the second administration of 50 lashes as part of the total of 1,000 lashes. And this barbaric punishment was imposed by the government of Saudi Arabia, not by a few fundamentalists, not by a few violent people operating on their own. How about Kuwait? The nation of Kuwait, where blasphemy against the Sunni version of Islam is punishable by death. I'm familiar with the case of a Canadian visiting Kuwait who, unfortunately for him and for the woman involved, conceived a child with her out of wedlock. He has been advised that unless he converts to Islam and marries this woman in an Islamic ceremony, she will be sentenced to prison for the rest of her life. It was in Kuwait that this kind of justice was administered and is being administered today. Now, is Francis prepared to tell the governments of Pakistan, Sudan, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and elsewhere that they are not authentic Muslims, that they do not follow authentic Islam, that their understanding of the Quran is defective? Really? Is he prepared to say that? Or should he not recognize that authentic Islam is not and never has been a religion of peace, but rather quite the opposite? Let us remember why Our Lady came to Fatima. She came to Fatima because it was named after a princess, the Princess of Orem, who converted to Catholicism, took the name Oriana, and abandoned her Muslim name of Fatima. Our Lady came to Fatima to preach the conversion of Russia and all peoples, including the Muslims, to the one true religion, the only religion of peace on the face of the earth, the one founded by the Prince of Peace himself. And this is why Pope Pius XI in the 1920s so rightly called upon Catholics throughout the Church Universal to pray that those who are living in the shadow of Islam be delivered from that darkness and brought forth into the light and the truth which is available only in the Catholic Church. And it was the Catholic Church that Our Lady of Fatima came to defend. Not pluralism, not the idea that Islam is a religion of peace. When she appeared at Fatima to speak of the consecration of Russia and the triumph of her Immaculate Heart. This, with all due respect to Pope Francis, is what he and the Catholic hierarchy should be seeking today. Not an accommodation with a religion that is rising again in Europe, that has always been spread by conquest and is marching in a new conquest of Europe once again, centuries after the Catholic Church had removed that threat by her militant opposition to the darkness of Islam. For Fatima Perspectives, this is Chris Ferrara.